Let's get going, but how should we welcome?
So the way we will do that today is I will say a great big howdy do to Sasha from everyone who is going to wave and welcome her with our jazz hands. And there we go. Jazz hands. Welcome, Sasha. It's all yours.
Sasha, we're going to give it to you now, and just so happy you can join us. And it's such a pleasure to see you after having seen you was it 3 weeks ago already in Vermont? It seems like longer, so shorter. Have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, there we go. That seemed to go on. Here's my welcome. Hi to you. It's wonderful. Kia ora koutou. We've got Sue, but just read. Okay. Oh, it's very special to have another New Zealander around too. But lovely to see you all, and especially having had the time in the United States. It's I feel like I'm talking with friends now. It's very special. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sasha, and I work for Harbour Hospice in Auckland. And when I began working for hospice, which was more than 10 years ago now, I was very struck by the goodness in the people that I was meeting with. It seemed like love was in action all around me, the doing of love. And I also noticed that people were often unaware of how their values were shining out in their day-to-day living. And these observations began to shape my practice. And I'd like to link these noticings to a quote which is very famous by Viktor Frankl from his book Man's Search for Meaning. It was published in 1959. And while it's a bit gendered, I think it carries an important message that is relevant to my area of work and informs some of my thinking. So I'll just read it to you. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And I think such a quote can be applied to the area of palliative care, I think, where people have lost so much. And it links to my keen interest in virtue inquiries. I've been asking myself a lot of questions about virtue inquiries, and in particular why they're so powerful, and also what gets in the way of people holding this knowledge about themselves. So I'm quite keen to hear what you think about that. I'm going to share some stories with you that illustrate what I'm talking about, and these are collaborative stories. So I just want to acknowledge the people who have allowed me to share these stories, and also just let you know that the identifying details have been changed. Okay. So when I talk about the word about virtue, I'm referring to Aristotelian expressions of goodness, such as compassion, kindness, patience, courage, loyalty, and love. In a virtue inquiry, as I understand it, is an inquiry a counsellor undertakes with a person or persons that listens for and researches virtues that are valued by that person or persons the counsellor is meeting with. And these inquiries draw on practices and ideas that have been developed by David Epstein, including getting to know the person ahead of the problem, researching moral virtue, and wonderfulness inquiries with children. And they also build from a paper by Eve Litchik called Interviewing with a Constructive Ear that had an influence on my early practice. And virtue inquiries take place with adults and young adults, and so they flow differently from wonderfulness inquiries. Now, many of the people that I meet don't have a narrative of themselves acting according to their values. They might have a partial knowing or a bit of a thin story, but many of them don't have any narrative at all, and it may be obscured. And I think that this is important in my area of work. So virtue inquiries require us to engage with Michael White's concept of double listening, of listening for what is being said, but also what is not being said, but is implicit in the conversation. And I mean, when I first joined hospice, I used to joke with some of my colleagues that I lived in the absent but implicit. When I think I hear possible stories of virtue when I'm speaking with people, I will ask some permission-seeking questions. So I'll ask people what they call what I'm hearing. I'll seek their permission to ask questions about it and explore it, and I'm checking to see whether this is something that they're interested in pursuing. People are very keen, almost always, to pursue these kinds of inquiries. I'm interested in tracking the history with them often of the virtue, and that might involve questions that track back through the generations, and also legacy questions that go forward. And that can be important at the end of life, because feeling connected can be very easing of suffering. When I'm meeting with couples and families, I'm asking for stories from other people, and this can be very powerful for a person to hear stories of themselves, and has added potency, I think, at the end of life. Now, I just want to reiterate, while I'm using the word virtue, it's not a word that I use with the people that I'm meeting with. I'm using their language and the words that they use. The only time I'd use virtue would be with a philosopher if they introduced it themselves. And believe it or not, that has happened once. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about why I use these kinds of inquiries and when, and then give some examples. I use virtue inquiries as part of a process of stepping into therapeutic conversations. I use them woven throughout conversations, which often involves bringing forward previously invisible stories. And there are some occasions where I might use it as the entire conversation, if a family is interested in doing so. And that might be, for example, if I'm meeting with a family once and someone's maybe dying, and that is going to be the only opportunity they have to speak together as a group. When I'm using them with particular intentions depending on who I'm meeting with, and I've got a bit of a list here, and I'm just going to go through the list, because there's quite a few reasons. I want to get to know people in ways that matter to them, and these kinds of inquiries really stand out to me as opening doorways into new territories of conversation. I meet with a lot of people who, because of my role, are unable to talk about illness and death, and I might have been asked by the team to see them, and I think they've often been very imposed upon and by the process in the health system, and really not seen in ways that they would like to be seen. And I'm just thinking now of an example that I gave actually in the workshop of a man who was probably a couple of weeks from death and was still very urgently pursuing cures and was refusing to talk about dying. And there was quite a lot of concern for him because I think the treatments weren't helping him. In fact, they were interfering with his quality of life. And I spent nearly an hour in this kind of inquiry, getting to know him through the stories of his life, his values, and what mattered to him. And he said to me towards the end of that I got it. And when I asked him what he thought I'd got, he said that he thought that I'd got why he felt cheated. And he was then able to go on and talk a little bit about his current experience. And he then told me that I was going to be his death philosopher, and he wasn't going to talk to anyone else, but he would be willing to talk to me. So that's just one example of many, many that show the new territories that we can go into. I also use these inquiries to bring forward identities other than the illness identity, which is very resourcing and helpful for people who are approaching death. I use them to dignify people and to give people an experience of themselves as worthy of respect. And I also use them to bring to people's attention how they are responding to the illness and the knowledge that they're dying. And generating an experience of agency is again very easing for people who are experiencing suffering. I'm also bringing forward a lens, a different kind of lens from the capitalistic lens that can mediate meaning making and lead to some very different meanings of the person's current experience and also of their life. You know, when people have been stripped of so much and are evaluating themselves according to having a particular type of body or earning so much money or having a particular role, this kind of lens through which they can look back at their life can be incredibly important. And as I just mentioned earlier, I use them also with an intention of connecting people to those that are important to them in their lives through tracking values. And also it can be very helpful perhaps for parents of young children to think about how they might be teaching their children about things that are important to them. So what I'd like to do is to read a collaborative story. I'm just going to read just a little bit about it that illustrates an example of me using such an inquiry to step into a conversation. And this was I think, on reflection, a very important inquiry. And we can talk about it when you hear what happens. But for the sake of the story, this man's chosen to be called Patrick or Paddy, and his son is also present, and he's called himself Liam. And this is part of a first conversation that we had. It's only a very short little segment, but it just gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, this man, Patrick or Paddy, had been suffering terribly with terrible symptoms of a disease, and he was receiving dialysis. And the people had been concerned for him for more than 6 months. In fact, some of the health professionals involved with him were quite distressed by what he was going through. And he wished to decide to stop dialysis, but every time he decided to stop, he changed his mind at the last minute and went again. And because of this, he was describing himself as a coward, and he was deeply ashamed of himself. Now, after 6 months of this going back and forth, his family persuaded him to see a counsellor, and that ended up being me. So I'm going to pick up the conversation. We're 10 minutes in, and I've asked his permission to ask him some questions about his life. His family are very sceptical about whether he's going to talk to me or not. They've told me he's very grumpy. And I've said to him that I think that people are much more than the illnesses that they're living with, and you know, would it be okay? And we've had a bit of a disruption because he's had a difficulty in breathing, and so there's been an interruption. And so we're just going to pick up where we start to talk again. Okay, so this is Patrick talking. Yeah, so we were doing some introductions. What do you want to know? Guided by Patrick's question, I reiterated, would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself to start with, perhaps? Speaking to the floor, he answered, not much to tell. Haven't thought about anything much other than trying to get through each day for ages. Let's see now. Well, for a start, you can call me Paddy. That's what my friends call me. I smiled appreciatively, thinking of his generosity in extending me his friendship. Thank you, Paddy. Is that Irish? Yeah, my grandparents came out from Ireland, he replied, lifting his eyes from the floor and focusing on a nearby corner. See that cello over there? Paddy directed. I turned my head to look with interest. Paddy leant forward and, in spite of his weakness, managed to convey a flicker of enthusiasm. Played it for years. It had a beautiful mellow sound until last year when I went downhill and couldn't play it anymore. Paddy hung his head with his body seeming to follow as he collapsed back to his chair. What a beautiful instrument. How did you come to learn the cello? What could have been a hint of pride entered Paddy's voice as he raised his eyes to meet mine a moment. My dad taught me, and then I've practiced it over the years. How old were you when your father began to teach you? I asked. Just a young nipper, must have been about 7, I suppose. Gee, that's young. What did your father see in you that made him think he could teach you the cello when you were only 7 years old? I exclaimed. Paddy furrowed his brow thoughtfully. I suppose he knew I'd work at it. I'm not one to take something lightly, if you know what I mean. You have to start out young with strings, ideally. I leant forward to better hear Paddy as I asked, when you say he knew you'd work at it and not take it lightly, would you mind explaining a little more of what you mean? Well, Paddy hesitated. He knew I'd practice, and you've got to do that if you want to learn to play, especially with a stringed instrument. You have to make the notes, you see. Even when I was a boy, if I set my mind to do something, I'd keep going with it. Again, I noted a glimmer of what could have been pride in Paddy's demeanour. My keen interest must have been evident on my face when Paddy caught my eye, because he then shared a story to explain further. When I was 4 years old, I decided I wanted to ride an old two-wheeler bike, and there was just no way anyone was going to stop me trying. Did it too in the end, just kept going till I did it. Paddy glanced at me with a small smile transforming his lined face for an instant. I responded immediately, caught up in the picture he had drawn of himself. What do you call this ability to keep going with something you want to do? Grit, I guess. I'm a hell of a determined kind of fellow, he replied, before returning to stare at the floor. You sure are, Dad, Liam echoed. What have you come to respect about your dad's grit and determination, would you say, Liam? Paddy peered at Liam while Liam told a story of Paddy never leaving a job unfinished, even if it became frustrating and difficult. Liam glanced at Paddy as he spoke, seeming to check he was listening. Paddy, has this ability to apply grit and determination shown up in other areas of your life? Yeah, pretty much everywhere. I would have been dead by now if I hadn't had it. It's important to do your best at things and not cop out, he replied with certainty, which suggested to me that this was a quality he valued. Would it be too much to ask for another story of you giving your best with grit and determination? I inquired, aware Paddy had little energy and might want to save it for other matters. Now, the reason that I read that story is, as I said, it's part of a very long inquiry into many virtues that Paddy held in his life. And much of what we've talked about hadn't been known to him previously, or not for a long time. And it led to some very dramatic things that followed. I think so when I reflect back. What happened then was that I saw him one more time, and 5 days later, and the reason it's so close was because he was so close to dying. And in that meeting, we picked up on some of those and began to really examine in small detail his process of decision making. And just a few days later, he made a decision to stop the dialysis. And the next time I saw him was in hospice when he was dying. And unsurprisingly, given what happened, I spent a lot of time thinking about the process of our conversations and what might have happened or been important that had allowed him to make a decision to die in the way that he wanted to. And I wasn't able to particularly check this out very easily with him, so I am left a little bit in the dark. But I was left thinking that perhaps the restoration of his dignity had moved him out from the corner and allowed him to make a decision. So that's why I've read that. Now, I'd just like to present to you one more idea before we break up into some small groups and talk about this. And that is that I've been thinking a lot about why people don't have ready access to their virtues. Why aren't they easily accessible? And in my context, I think there's some particular reasons, and I bet there's a lot more than what I'm about to say, and I'm actually dying to hear what you've got to say. But I think one reason is that the people that I meet with are actually feeling often really bad, even though they're acting in ways that are quite wonderful. And for example, they might be exhausted or irritable or feeling guilty even. I saw a woman last week who was so overtaken by feelings of guilt and sadness that she was unable to see the absolutely amazing ways that she'd cared for her life partner. And she couldn't see them at all. And yet the nurses that I work with and I, when he was alive, we could see it so clearly. So I think that people's feelings are not very accurate guides of what they're actually doing, but that does tend to be what they're going by. I think the fact that this lens is not part of the dominant ideas about what we consider to be worthwhile. Well, society doesn't. We ourselves might think this is very important. And I think also in my practice, virtue is often located in people's intentions and values and hopes and wishes. And an example of that I'll give you to just illustrate how it might not be at first glance visible is I meet with quite a few people who are angry. And I went recently to visit a woman who had been described as behaving very badly and not complying with processes in hospital. And her partner, her life partner, was dying. There's a young couple, they had kids. When I arrived at the house, there was a lot of people there, lots of friends, and there was a shared understanding that she was behaving badly and an angry person. At first of all, I thought, all these people, this is going to be a little bit tricky, and maybe I need a private conversation. But anyway, it wasn't what they wanted, and then we went. And what happened was that she was angry because her partner had been told that he was going to die on his own in the hospital. So it was a very justified anger in my view. And the anger was really about advocacy. She was advocating for better care for him. And once this had all been unravelled, she agreed that, you know, to some very different meanings and descriptions of herself, and that the audience became very important because it was then a shared understanding. And that would be quite a common example for me. And I'm going to just read you a story about someone who's being described as angry in a sec. The other thing is, I think that there's a lot of prescriptive ideas in my context of work that mediate meaning and position people unhelpfully, and they obscure virtue. I've written a little example here in my notes. One of them is people come into the hospice for what's called respite. They come in so that a family can have a break. And if a partner comes in too, and perhaps gets up in the night, then they're not seen as taking advantage of the break. They're seen as not looking after themselves. And that can be really unhelpful, because actually people are acting out of love and what matters to them. And if they go along with these prescriptions, it can lead to a lot of regret later. So I think some of the prescriptive ideas in my place of work very often obscure people acting according to their values. Now I'm just going to, before we go into groups, just read you an example which is related to what I've just said. This comes from a collaborative story that I wrote with the woman Claudia in the story. And it describes the different meanings that we can arrive at from these inquiries. Now, as I read, if you could just note what I'm listening for. This is from A Small Hope. And the work is with Tom and Claudia, and they have 2 young children. Over the following week, I heard that Tom had stopped eating and was now unable to leave his bed. The nurses told me that Claudia had insisted no one speak to her about his symptoms or deteriorating condition. So at the end of the week, I went to see Tom and Claudia as we had arranged. Claudia and I sat outside in the garden at an old wooden table. Tom was inside sleeping, too sick to talk. The garden provided a quiet place, private place away from the activity of the household, as all the extended family worked together to care for him and the girls. Tired, harrowed faces had welcomed me, and in the heavy movements of the family, I thought I could feel unspoken sadness weighing down every step. Claudia looked up as the leaves ruffled in the morning air. "It's been a better week," she told me. When you look back on the last 2 weeks, do you have some ideas about what has contributed to this week being better? I asked. "I've stopped looking ahead," Claudia replied. Not wanting to presume what Claudia meant, I responded, "May I ask, where do you look when you're not looking ahead?" "No one can know exactly what's going to happen, can they?" Claudia replied. "Now I only think about today, and I have some hope." Could you help me to understand a little of what this hope is to you? Claudia paused, bowing her head. "It is only a small hope," she said in a little voice, as if confessing something. "To be with Tom for another day, or maybe even a few days." Claudia looked up at me with tears gleaming in her eyes. "May I ask what difference this small hope makes to you?" I replied, moved by the humility of her hope. I sat by the window and told Tom what I saw outside. We spent some time talking quietly together once Imogen was at school. I made him a little something for lunch and we sat together. He told me being together like that was perfect, and he's never said that before. As you look out the window describing the view to Tom, what does this small hope do that has Tom finding your time together perfect? I enjoy the moment, and he feels that. It helps me forget what is coming, Claudia explained. I think I'll just stop there. So that illustrates the listening of virtue and the very different meanings that can arise other than perhaps a description of denial. So now might be a helpful time to move into the small groups. Where's Larry?
Yes, while I'm composing the groups, it takes me a minute. Do you want to frame the questions that you're hoping the group will discuss?
Yeah.
Peggy, did you want to post them?
Yeah, I just posted them for you. They're for, you could just read them to us all, maybe, Sasha. They're in the chat. And first want to say, Sue, don't worry about the all red. It gives us a bit of color on this, for us, a winter day. So no worries there.
Thanks, Peggy. So I was just wanting to invite you really to discuss how you think virtue inquiries, how you use virtue inquiries, or how you might do so in your own practice. I'm interested in you answering the questions and bringing them back to the wider group. Why do you think that they might be powerful? And also, what do you think gets in the way of people's own knowledge of themselves with respect to their values and the way that they act on those values? Knowledge of their own virtues. Okay.
We are on.
Remember to take off your mutes if you'd like to say something. Would anyone like to share how they use these kinds of inquiries and pursue them, or how they might do so?
I think I use this all the time. I work with many young people, and I always start off with getting to know them apart from any problem that might have brought them to come see me. And it's just, it's just pure delight to talk to 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old about what they're interested in, what they like to do. And then I start volunteering guesses, so you like drawing, you like, magic books about magic, etc. Should I guess that maybe you're a creative or an imaginative person? And so it's just always fun to do that with children, just to suggest an interpretation, and they are, of course, quick to either pick up and run with it or correct me.
Anyone else like to share some thoughts?
I had a really powerful experience of this on the other side when we were at a training in Boston with, I don't remember who was training, but I was with Corky Becker, who's another therapist in our community, our larger community, and she interviewed me as part of the day. And that, as is often the case, when you feel this stuff firsthand, it really grabs you how important it is. And it was when one of my first grandson was just born, and I was taking care of him a lot and working, and I was just doing it because it felt like the right thing to do, but I hadn't reflected on it yet. And when she had me reflect on it, and one of the sentences she just said is, "It sounds like you're living very close to your values." And what happened in that moment was so much energy was released just to do it. And I've tried to give that space to everyone I've met since then in the consultation room, because the sensation of liberated energy was quite remarkable. I wasn't beleaguered or anything. I was having a fabulous time, but there was something else that happened that was really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of fun to do these wonderfulness interviews at the beginning when someone comes to you. I work with children too, and everybody's kind of like taken completely aback because they expect that in the first interview that they're going to have this whole problem story, and especially if the kids are teens, it's like, what? You know, I'm not going to be spending the whole day with everybody saying all the terrible things that I've done. And it just changes the direction of the whole process, which is really, I'm so appreciative of David Epstein and his serendipitous finding of the wonderfulness interviews.
I think for me, I'm really pursuing this with adults. It's not something that I'm spending a short time on. I might spend a very long time because people are making sense of their lives. Do you all have times when you're really pursuing it in this way?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I feel that's what I'm doing completely in the whole process of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something in my experience about how the pursuit of this with adults is somehow trickier than with
No, with kids know it.
Can suspend disbelief. Kids suspend disbelief somehow in, you know, they're not as, you know, they don't have as ossified a problem-saturated account of themselves. They can easily enter the world of imagination in which they're more, you know, wonderful or heroic or full of various virtues that we're talking about. But adults are harder to drag in this direction. I work at it. And I think some of my ideas for working with adults comes from my work with kids. But I don't know, Sasha, one of my fantasies is that maybe adults go there more easily, you know, when all bets are off, right? And they're at the end of their life, and you know, there's something about that time to stop and reconsider that's different from my work with adults who are in the middle of their problematic lives.
I think they might be more open to it, but I think that there's a lot of things that actually get in the way. But bringing forward that lens can make an enormous difference to people. Yeah. Anyone else got any experiences of that?
Well, I work with adults who have been in therapy. Many of them have been in therapy for many years, and at a community setting, at an agency. And I find it a lot of times when people come in, there is this expectation of talking about the problem. And I think one of the biggest challenges in identifying the values and virtues is by talking about the problems for so many years, they have become so dominant that they shadow all these virtues and values. And so when I ask them questions about, similar to the questions that you were talking about of why they dislike to act a certain way, or where did they learn it from, and how that connects to what is important to them. And when they name it, there's this, it feels like a release, like I believe Jenny was saying, it's like this moment of, oh, I didn't think about that. And it creates an opportunity to be able to talk about this other story that had hardly ever talked about because the focus was the problem. So the way in my work, I realized that that has been one of the biggest barriers. And when actually people start talking about these values and where they come from and how they've learned them, it completely changes the narrative.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were speaking, I work with problems that are unfixable and also silenced. So I'm looking to lay alongside descriptions of what people are living with and witnessing and acknowledging that, also the way that they respond, which is also invisible. So, and I think that unfixable quality and the fact that the problem is silenced as well is also important in this, what makes it different. Yeah.
And taking for granted, like sometimes when people name the ways that they have been working with a problem, and it's easy to not focus on them, to identify them, to talk about them, and assuming like maybe if other therapists did not take the time or pay attention or stop there and ask more questions, I think it's easy to kind of like not notice them. I did this and then move on to, but the problem did this. So that's an opportunity to, I think it's a great opportunity to be able to pause and talk about that before the problem comes back into the conversation.
Oh, sorry. You know, I just wanted to say really just briefly that I have been on the receiving end of these kinds of interviews. In particular, when I was going through cancer treatment the first time, and I was very ill, and the prognosis wasn't great. And I found it was really difficult to have real conversations with my friends and colleagues. I was spending a lot of time trying to comfort them. And there was one person who stood by me, and that was Kristen Collison, and she's in this salon today, but she's not in our group. I didn't know her very well. She was a young person, new therapist, relatively new. And she asked if she could come to my home and interview me. And if she could do that over a series of interviews. And she came to my home. Nobody else knew about it. And for about 10 weeks, about once a week, she came to my home. And we talked, and she interviewed me about these kinds of things. And one thing I wanted to say that was particularly unique, I mean, I was surrounded by a lot of really good narrative therapists. So, but what was unique in what Kristen did was that Kristen was the only person that allowed me to talk about walking hand in hand with death every day. No one could speak of death. It was too overwhelming. So not only was it talking about virtues and my values and what was important to me and how I wanted to live the rest of my time, but also to be able to talk about how I live with death every day. You know, and here I am 10, 15 years later, still living with death every day. But I just so appreciated being able to have someone who was able to interview me and talk about how I wanted to be remembered, what I wanted my legacy to be, how I wanted to talk about my relationship with death, with people that were really frightened and overwhelmed by seeing me so ill.
Thank you for saying that, because and sharing your personal experience. I think it really highlights for me the importance of saying that these kinds of inquiries aren't about cheering up.
Because that made things worse for me.
Yeah, and there's such a pressure on people to be positive in the context of my practice, you know, in palliative care. These are authentic, real conversations that often accompany conversations of suffering, don't they? And it's also very important, that point about acknowledging that what people are living with is not fixable and it is silenced and it must be acknowledged. These are stories that are laying alongside and are not, I never use the word counter-storing because it it buys into that whole warlike metaphor stuff that's so frequently used. Yeah, so thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate it.
Pardon? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. My question is, I'm wondering what you find silencing, and is it the sense of nobody likes a complainer, or I need to be brave, or that sort of thing? Is there a story of not complaining, being brave, being stoic that is silencing? Is that when you talk about the silencing, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on whether someone takes up a stance of wanting to be positive. That's quite different, and then maybe they can walk a middle path and it works very well for them. But for many people, what Carla Willig talks about is a cultural imperative, the to be positive, that we must be positive, can be very silencing of stories of suffering and talking about dying. And so yes, exactly, and it has visitors and friends feeling that cheering up, feeling that they can't talk about death or about the difficult parts of a person's experience. So those ideas can be very silencing on everyone.
Just let me butt in for a quick minute. I'm going to summon the rest of the groups back. They'll be back in about a minute, so that gives us about a minute to wrap up.
I just want to say that with the palliative care with children that I've done for many, many years, the silencing often was actually even the parents, that they were saying, don't talk about death with the children. They don't know. They always knew. But there's this sort of misunderstanding that, I definitely respected it. Like I didn't use the word death, but the kids always know. People know, right? And including children, and they have their stories and their legacies that they want to live. But it was like a dance, a very delicate dance that you played to respect everyone, including the children who wanted to talk about death, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's finding a way that the person wants to talk about it with adults. Many adults don't want to speak about death directly, but they have ways that they do want to talk, and times when they want to talk and not talk. It's respecting that, isn't it? Yeah.
It's like with Claudia, where her little hope was have one more day. So it wasn't that she was denying that her husband was dying. She had a little hope for one more day, or maybe two.
Yeah, yeah. But that hadn't come forward at all. All had been visible was her sticking up for herself in the way that she wanted to do it, and that had people, describing her in some particular ways that weren't helpful. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. We didn't talk about what we wanted to take back to the wider group. Would anyone like to speak to that, maybe?
Right.
A conversation that reminded them that they were actually dying.
Yeah.
That was the restraint.
Yeah.
Right on.
Hi everyone. Are we all back?
I think we are all back.
Wow.
Yeah, I think we are.
Great.
This is miraculous.
And
Amazing. Yeah.
yes. Would someone like to offer some thoughts about what you discussed, or your thoughts about those questions, perhaps?
I guess that you said we didn't decide what we wanted to bring back, and I have no idea what we really want to bring back. But one of the things is that ways that people have the knowledge of themselves, you know, finding the knowledge of how they can talk about death or in what way they talk about death, and respecting all the varieties, all the possibilities, but be listening in a way rather than judging, which so many healthcare, I mean, I even was getting judged with talking about death with children, not just by the parents, but by other staff. You know, how can you do that? So I'm not talking about death with them. They're talking about death with me. And but that stands in the way. We as healthcare professionals, I think, stand in the way often of allowing people to talk about what they want to talk about. Not narrative therapists, I hope, but others.
Yeah, our group in the between the question was the virtue inquiries in the practice, and we Kristen brought up the landscape of consciousness, the reflection of influence of unfavorable conditions as time pressures, and what your accomplishments and how you face the dominant discourses. And then Peggy said the construct of someone in the way of life and how we package and listened it over a collective space, and the guided principles that we have in the world. But one of the biggest things, and I'll take some of this, was I was hesitant to say something because it was something of the word virtue itself. And we in narrative, we talk about values and what they mean to us. And we kind of looked it up, and it's the way that we connect to the universe. Peggy looked up the actual definition, and it had this kind of religious connotation to it, and a secular meaning associate with a religious context, and a quote, the behavior showing a high moral standard. And it's the seventh highest order in some Christian doctrine. I gave up listening at that point, but it was something that was, it is that. So our values that we hold now in a virtuous sense was kind of a big point of our conversation, and the meanings.
Did you come up with a better word?
Oh, no, no, I did not. If someone else did, go for it.
I'd be interested to hear other words, suggestions for words.
Well, I forget the name of who said it in our group, but just we closed with her saying that curiosity is love, or love is curiosity. And I was thinking that was a takeaway for me from tonight, and that watching you, Sasha, your curiosity is so beautiful and so loving at the same time, and so powerful. So just, I will take that away. Curiosity can be love. Anyway, that's not naming virtues, but it's words carrying a lot of meaning.
Thank you. Yeah. Wondering about another person's world and what it's like. Yeah. I was reminded very helpfully by some comments and questions that were in the group that I was in that I just wanted to say, and a couple of those were, I think it's very important to say that these inquiries are not cheer-ups. They're not trying to make people feel better in a sort of a cheering up sense, or be positive when things are really difficult. And we had a bit of a conversation about acknowledging suffering and dying, and that these are stories that are authentic and go alongside, and are often woven into stories that acknowledge and witness, conversations that witness and acknowledge suffering. So that was one point that I didn't say that I think is really important. Yeah, I can't remember the other right now.
Yeah, I'll just jump on that. That was one of the takeaways from our conversation, at least for me. I think it was Ian who was talking about this kind of inquiry and how it makes space for experiences of joy and delight alongside the pain, and trusting that the people that are in conversation with us can hold more than one thing, right? In fact, they welcome those little sparks of delight and being honored and witnessed, and having those aspects of what they accord value to in their lives validated in that way. Yeah, it sounds like very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really appreciated Kristen did this in our group, but just the tracing back to Michael White and just thinking it, just bringing back the memories of the conversations where not even necessarily at the end of life, but just generally of really tracking what someone gives value to in a very particular way, in the particularities of their lives. And Sasha, I love the way you do that and remind someone of that.
Thank you. Yes, I love his work about trauma and relating it to the work that I do. Yeah.
Do you want us also to address that second question then?
Yes. What do you think gets in the way? You come from different practice contexts from me, perhaps some of you. I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that, on people knowing these things about themselves, having formed narratives about how they're acting according to their values.
So Ian, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you were answering this question when we got yanked back into the bigger group, and I was curious to know if you remember what point you were making there in response to this question.
Oh, there we go. So, well, I'm thinking about, I did some volunteer work in hospice many years ago, and one of the experiences I had was when I walked into a room, at times, not with everybody, but I would be the person that would be reminding them that they could talk about death. And that would remind them of their death, and then they wouldn't talk about it. So my very presence in some way was a restraint to them talking, if that makes sense. So I guess it's a bit like sometimes going to a therapist and the person might have a problem, but the very fact of coming to the therapist means they may not want to talk about it. There's a sort of a paradox in a way. So that's what I was thinking about, the presence. And sometimes having a conversation with somebody one day and it seems to go well, and then turning up the next day and they may have said more than what they intended, or they may have been reflecting on what they had spoken about. And so my presence becomes a restraint in some way to them going further. And that's to be opened up and explored if possible. But that's where I was kind of heading when I was mentioning that.
Thank you.
And one of the things that we said in our group that I noted was that there's so much emotion around illness and death, and that emotion can get around the knowledge about learning about yourself and your experiences and your virtues and your values, whether they be now or later, and that humans as characters have such a connection with the negative moral character, and harder times expressing the social acceptable stuff that we have, or our higher values that we can now fully express to other people when dealing with death and an illness that's going to take us.
Yeah.
One of the things you highlighted in the workshop and again today is that so many people have lost so much at the time that we meet, and I've often heard people say they don't even recognize their life or who they are anymore. And so these conversations and these reconnections to things that are cherished and valued often seem to be a coming back to who I am, or a realization. underneath all that's so terrifying and unfamiliar, a reconnection and your questions. And we were saying in our group, your approach, being so gentle and so respectful. You were describing these points where you find yourself on the threshold of a doorway, and before charging into the room or into someone's life, that you make sure you're invited in, and make a connection at that point that sets the stage. So all of those things, I think what you embody in your approach and these inquiries are so opposite to what people may have been experiencing, and their sense of kind of forgetting almost who they are.
Yeah. 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 I think my hope would be in these inquiries that people feel truly seen and heard. And I think that's just so important, isn't it? Thank you, William. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Any other thoughts about why they might be powerful, or what gets in the way of people knowing this about themselves?
I have a quote from Stephen Levine. It's a book called Who Dies? And it's something that's dear to my heart. And I read it, it was given to me when my father passed away on my birthday about 16 years ago. And I was looking through before this, and I saw it, and it says, when we realize we are already dead, our priorities change, our heart opens, and our mind begins to clear the fog of our holdings and pretendings. We watch all life in transit, and we matter what becomes instantly apparent. The transmission of love, the letting go of obstacles to understand, the relinquishment of our grasping, of our hiding from ourselves. Seeing the mercilessness of our self-strangulation, we begin to become gently into the light which we share with all beings. If we take each teaching, each loss, each gain, each fear, each joy as it arises, and experience it fully, life becomes more workable. We are no longer a victim of life, and then every experience, even with the loss of our dearest one, becomes another opportunity for awakening. Yeah, and that really just, the barriers that we take behind us and in that time, that not knowing about ourselves, is we have this thing called life, and life just stops us in our interpretation of it, and how we view someone and the perspective or the perception of them. And it's like, wow, that's not who they were. They meant well sometimes, and I didn't see that. So, okay, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sasha, do you have thoughts about what to do next? We've always, before we had the breakout rooms, we kept our Collab Salon to an hour. And then when we started the breakout rooms, we seemed to, people said we needed to expand out to have a bit more time. But we also, we're in the zone now of ending whenever you or we all like, and sometimes people kind of trickle away at some point.
Okay, I think I'll be guided by the group. I didn't realize it was going for a bit longer, so I'm feeling quite comfortable. Yeah. Are there any other comments from anyone else? Yeah, I'm just thinking there's some things that are quite important to me in this, and which we've said, I think, and some of them are around really acknowledging and witnessing people's suffering, and that these aren't cheer up, that it is something quite different, but just the power of giving people bringing forward that option of being able to respond in ways that are meaningful to them, with problems that are unsolvable, can be, it astounds me actually. And also, I'm sorry to say, but especially having some experiences of this with my own family, of how little people are seen in this way at a time when it really matters. Sometimes I think the pain of not being seen according to what, according to your good intentions and what you value, can be more painful in a crisis or at the end of life. So, yeah, I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that before we go, but yeah.
I was thinking of something that I learned from one of my teachers, and it was actually in reference to parenting. And he said, you know, as a general rule, we're at our worst when we're parenting from fear. And after a couple of years, we were at the same conference again, and I said, I've been trying to answer the question in my head, how do you think we're at our best as parents? And he surprised me. I thought it would be something like courage or something. And he said, when we're fascinated. And that's the memory that really was resonating for me, is the fear of being with somebody, you know, who is suffering, who is in pain, who, you know, to give them hope is probably meaningless, false hope, you know, that people just kind of come in the presence of somebody who's dying with empty hands. And it's very, very frightening. And how difficult, as somebody else was saying, to be the recipient of one of those visits where you need to cheer up or reassure the people who are coming to see you. And so your description of your conversations, Sasha, are, you know, that you're so interested, you're deeply and sincerely interested and curious and ready and willing to ask good questions and hear people's answers. That just how meaningful that is, you know, kind of came through from even your brief examples, and thank you for that.
Thank you. I really like the emphasis on curiosity. I was thinking about, and you might have examples in your practice about all the areas that I ask, which are normally forbidden. For instance, when that man Paddy told me about what happened led into a conversation about him being afraid of dying, you know, then I'm wondering about, well, which bit of dying are you afraid of? So as you were speaking about curiosity, I was just thinking about how we then had a whole conversation about what exactly it was and which part of dying it was that he was afraid of. It was actually the process of dying, not any ideas about afterwards. So yeah, that's really helpful for me, those comments. Thank you. Are there any other thoughts before we stop?
I want to just say something about practice, because when I look back on the conversations that I regret with people close to me, like my godfather, say, who, when he was dying and I was brought into his hospital room, and I was kind of freaked out by his appearance and by what I wish I could go back feeling hopefully more comfortable now than I did 20, 25 years ago. And it's hard, isn't it? Because you don't really get another chance with that particular person necessarily.
Yeah, it is hard. Time changes, not only for people who are living with a life-ending illness and their families, but actually for me as somebody meeting with them. And you heard, I saw that man 5 days later. That changes, and there isn't going back. And I was absolutely shocked by the outcome of our meetings, actually, because he had said to me on that second session, as I was going out the door, he said to me, I've got hope for my life. And I thought that he'd decided that he was going to continue, and he decided the opposite. So yeah, no, there is no going back. But also I was thinking, Peggy, I think for me in this work, it's very much about my actions as well as what I say, and seeing a person, not the illness. And I think that can take some practice, hey? It's not something, we're not exposed to people who are very, very unwell, and all the paraphernalia is part of daily life usually. And so when it's not familiar territory, it can be a shock. Yeah. Mm.
Can I just speak up here, because what Sasha, thank you so much for so much inspiration, but one of the old Aboriginal men in Australia was interviewed about his life, and he said his battery's running out, and that was his description of him starting to go towards dying. And I love that phrase. And so now when I have conversations with my mother, she's in a nursing home, so she's got a lot of people around her dying. So we talk about the battery idea. And so we're actually creating a liminal phase between life and death. And I find it really is able to create really good, safe conversations with her. So I think the languaging around these things is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Yeah. And ideas of liminality too. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, it's my job just to see if anyone, especially anyone who hasn't spoken, has anything kind of burning that you want to say, and then we have a couple things to do before we close this down. Anyone want to speak up? That no pressure intended, but just want to make sure to make space for you.
I just wanted to say a quick acknowledgement to Kristen Collison and Peggy Sachs, who were two people who had these kind of conversations with me during a time when I was very, very ill and when my prognosis wasn't very good. I was able to have conversations, and very much like what you're talking about, Sasha, as we talked about in our breakout group. And it made a huge difference for me when that time was, most people were really either jollying me up, wanting to cheer me up, or trying to pretend that nothing was happening. So thank you to Peggy and Kristen.
Seems like a long time ago. Yeah. Sasha, thank you so much. What a joy to see you again 3 weeks later, and to know this will come again and again. And Sasha has stepped forward to say she's going to be sort of our New Zealand liaison for the Collab Salon. So, and I know she brought Sue with her today, which was just so great. Sue in red, who's now in person, we can see, and others as well. So thank you for that. And we also have Ian here, here you are, Ian. Ian is our next Collab presenter. Do you want to say a little bit about what you're going to be doing?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Peggy. Well, next time, the title of the presentation is Fields of Kindness, an Antidote to Tyrannical Devaluing. And the emphasis will be on some particular work with a couple of people one particular person who hears voices, and some of these voices are very much tyrannical at times in his life. And so I've become interested with him in somatic forms of fields of kindness and linking this with remembering conversations. So it's a mixture of the storied, the affective, and the bodied. And I'll have some of his voice present for us to reflect upon on the effects of these conversations. So he's very keen for this to get out, actually. And so I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
course, here in the US, we don't know anything about fields of kindness and tyranny of some sort of. I immediately go to a political place with your description of your December. So there's many different applications. Yeah. Hey, thanks everybody. That was great. Yeah.
Thanks, Sasha.
Great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice
Thank
to see you all.
Thank you. Bye.